Most people will live their entire lives defending shadows, fighting illusions, and calling them truth, never realizing the chains were not iron, but belief. Sit with me for a moment. Imagine the fire is low, the night quiet, and time has slowed enough for thought to breathe. This story does not begin in markets or money, but in the human mind, where every fortune is first built or quietly destroyed. Long before charts, before currencies, before the word investment existed, there was a cave, a place not of stone alone, but of habit, fear, and comfort. In that cave, people learned to confuse repetition with reality, movement with meaning, and noise with truth. You have felt this cave before, in the endless scrolling of glowing screens, in the nervous hum of market tickers flashing red and green like omens, in headlines designed not to inform, but to seize your attention and never let it go. We are told this is the world. We are told this is how wealth moves, how success works, how life must be lived. And most never question it. Because questioning is painful. Because turning toward the light burns before it heals. Tonight, I will not promise shortcuts. I will not whisper tricks. I will offer something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Sight. We will walk through forgotten histories where entire civilizations mistook shadows for substance, where fortunes rose and collapsed on illusions, and where a rare few learned to see what others could not. This is not entertainment. It is initiation. If this journey speaks to you, if you feel something ancient stirring as we begin, take a quiet moment to support this work. Like the video, subscribe to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or leave a small donation if you wish. It helps keep the fire burning for those still searching for the exit. Now breathe. The cave is behind us. The story is just beginning. There is a moment in every civilization when the shadows grow louder than reality, and those who mistake the noise for truth call themselves informed. Picture this. A man sits alone in a dim room at midnight. The glow of numbers dances across his face. Green, red, green again. He feels intelligent, empowered, connected to something vast and important. He believes he is watching reality unfold in real time. But what he is truly watching is a wall. And on that wall, shadows flicker. Reflections of actions taken elsewhere by forces he does not see, does not understand, and has never met. Yet he reacts. He buys. He sells. His heart races. His sleep erodes. His sense of self begins to depend on the movement of light on stone. This is not a modern story. It is an ancient one, long before screens and stock exchanges, before algorithms and high-frequency trading. Human beings were already prisoners of illusion. Plato did not invent the cave to sound clever. He described it because he recognized something terrifying and permanent about the human condition. That most people do not want truth. They want familiarity. They want reassurance. They want to be told that what they are already staring at is all there is. The cave is warm. The chains are familiar. The shadows are entertaining. Every era has its cave. In one century, it was religion without reflection. In another, monarchy without question. Today, it is information without wisdom. We drown in data and starve for understanding. We scroll endlessly, Believing exposure equals insight. We track prices, opinions, predictions, and trends. Believing proximity to motion means proximity to meaning. But meaning does not flicker. Meaning endures. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people are not poor because they lack opportunity. They are poor because they mistake noise for signal. They chase reflections and call it strategy. They confuse activity with progress. They react instead of perceive. And in doing so, they become perfect prisoners. Not because someone locked them in, but because leaving would require them to admit that much of what they believed was never real. The market knows this. Institutions know this. Entire industries are built upon your willingness to stare at shadows and call them facts. The faster you react, the easier you are to guide. The more emotional you become, the more predictable you are. And predictability is the raw material of profit for those who stand outside the cave, watching calmly. This is not a story about money alone. It is about sovereignty, about whether your attention belongs to you or to the fire behind you, about whether you live responding to echoes or acting from understanding. Wealth is simply the consequence. Freedom is the prize. Tonight, we will walk through the cave slowly. We will not rush toward the light, rushing blinds. Instead, we will examine the shadows themselves, where they come from, why they move the way they do, who benefits when you mistake them for substance, and how, quietly and without drama, some individuals throughout history learned to turn their heads while others laughed, mocked, or attacked them for doing so. This is not motivation. This is orientation. If you are still listening, it means part of you already senses the wall is not the world. Stay with me. The fire is behind us. The exit exists. And what waits outside will change how you see everything you once thought was real. The winter air in Amsterdam in the year 1636 carried the scent of canals, damp wool, and impossible dreams. Merchants leaned close in candlelit taverns, voices low but urgent, hands trembling not from cold but from anticipation. On rough wooden tables lay contracts worth more than townhouses. Not for land, not for ships, not for gold. For flowers, tulips. They arrived in Europe quietly, carried from the Ottoman Empire as curiosities. Exotic, rare, beautiful in a way that felt almost artificial. Their colors seemed unreal, as if painted by a careless god who spilled too much pigment. At first, they belonged to the gardens of the wealthy, symbols of taste and status. But then something strange happened. A virus infected certain bulbs, creating streaks of flame like patterns that could not be replicated. These broken tulips became objects of obsession. Each was unique. Each felt irreplaceable. Each seemed destined to rise in value simply because others desired it. Markets formed in back rooms and inns. Men who had never planted a flower in their lives spoke with authority about bulbs buried deep in frozen ground they would never see. Futures contracts were traded months before blooms emerged. Entire life savings changed hands on promises written in ink and sealed with optimism. At its peak, a single bulb could command the price of a grand canal house. Families sold farms. artisans abandoned their trades. Everyone believed they were early. Everyone believed they were seeing reality, but what they were seeing were shadows. The tulip itself did not change. Its beauty remained the same. Its usefulness did not increase. Only the projection grew larger on the wall. And projections, no matter how convincing, cannot feed a city. When confidence cracked, it did not shatter loudly. It dissolved. Buyers vanished. Contracts were abandoned. The wall went dark. Fortunes evaporated not because the tulips lost value, but because they never possessed the value assigned to them. The cave had collapsed. Here is the lesson most histories soften. Tulip Mania was not stupidity. It was normal human perception operating under illusion. Intelligent men participated. Experienced traders believed. What failed was not reason, but orientation. They faced the wall, not the source. And markets have not changed. Every speculative frenzy follows the same geometry. A compelling narrative, a scarce object, social proof, rapid price movement, and finally, the belief that this time is different. The shadows grow sharper, the fire burns hotter, and those still chained confuse intensity for truth. The quiet few who survive do something radical. They turn around. They ask what produces the shadow. They ask who controls the fire. They ask what remains when attention moves elsewhere. This is the beginning of real investing. Not buying, not selling, but seeing. Tulips were only the first modern lesson. Many more are coming. The story begins not with greed, but with wonder. Imagine Amsterdam in the early 17th century, when the city still smelled of wet timber and salt, when ships returned heavy with spices, silk, and rumors from lands most would never see. The canals reflected a sky often gray, but beneath that gray lived a restless hunger. This was a young republic, newly freed from empire, intoxicated by trade, and discovering for the first time what it meant to grow rich without kings. Into this world came a flower, not loudly, not triumphantly. It arrived as a curiosity, a gift carried from the Ottoman court, passed from hand to hand among botanists and scholars. The tulip did not announce itself as destiny. It sat quietly in gardens, its stem modest, its bloom strangely precise, as if designed rather than grown. At first, only the wealthy noticed. They prized it the way collectors prize rare manuscripts, not for use, but for distinction. Then something changed. A disease, invisible and poorly understood, infected certain bulbs. It fractured their colors, drawing flames across petals, streaks of white through crimson, veins of purple that looked painted by intention rather than chance. These broken tulips could not reproduce their beauty reliably. Each one became singular, irrepeatable, and in that singularity, the human mind did what it has always done. It began to assign meaning. People did not fall in love with tulips. They fell in love with the idea of owning what others could not. At first, prices rose slowly, almost politely. A merchant might trade a fine coat for a bulb. A brewer might exchange a barrel of beer. These trades felt harmless, even charming. But beneath them, something darker was taking shape. The flower was becoming a mirror. People were no longer asking what it was worth. They were asking what others believed it was worth. And that question is where reality begins to thin. Winter came, and the ground froze. The tulips vanished underground, unseen. And in their absence, imagination took over. Trading moved indoors, into taverns lit by candles and warmed by alcohol and anticipation. Contracts were written for bulbs that would not be unearthed for months. Men who had never knelt in soil spoke confidently about future blooms. They traded not flowers, but expectations. Listen closely here. This is important. The tulips themselves were no longer present. What was being exchanged was a shadow, a promise, a projection cast onto the wall by collective belief. And belief, when shared, feels solid. It feels safe. It feels like knowledge. As prices rose, participation spread. Artisans, sailors, clerks, ordinary people watched neighbors profit and felt something tighten in their chest. Not greed, but fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of missing what everyone else seemed to see so clearly. This fear pushed them closer to the wall, eyes wide, necks straining, desperate not to blink. The city hummed with it. Conversations shifted. Work felt slower than speculation. Patience felt foolish. Why labor for years when profit could arrive in weeks? Why question when numbers only went up? This is how caves form, not through deception imposed from above, but through agreement among those inside. Each person believes they are choosing freely, yet all are responding to the same shadows. The wall grows brighter. The fire burns hotter. And anyone who questions the spectacle is met with laughter, then irritation, then silence. By early 1637, a single rare bulb could command the price of a house on the canal. Think about that. Brick and timber, shelter and legacy, exchanged for something that lived half its life unseen beneath frozen ground. And still, few hesitated, because hesitation would require turning around. It would require asking where the light came from, and whether it could be extinguished. But shadows do not warn you before they disappear. When confidence broke, it did so quietly. There was no riot, no dramatic collapse. One auction failed to attract buyers, then another. Then a few men began to hesitate, not because they understood the illusion, but because they sensed the crowd thinning. And once the crowd thins, belief loses its weight. Contracts were abandoned. Promises dissolved. Courts refused to enforce agreements made in intoxicated optimism. The wall went dim, and those who had built their lives upon its glow found themselves staring at stone. The tulips did not change. They bloomed as they always had. What vanished was the shadow. This is the first lesson, and it is cruel in its simplicity. Markets do not punish ignorance. They punish misplaced certainty. The people of Amsterdam were not fools. They were human. They trusted what they saw reflected by others. They assumed that collective agreement was proof of truth. And here, by the fire, I want you to feel this, not judge it. Because the cave is not behind us in history. It is around us now. The names change. The objects change. The technology becomes faster and brighter. but the geometry remains identical. Before we speak of charts, or capital, or strategy, you must understand this. Wealth begins with orientation, with knowing whether you are facing the wall or the fire, whether what moves your emotions is substance or merely light dancing on stone. We are still inside the cave, but now, at least, you know where to look. By the time the fever reached its height, something subtle had already broken inside the city. It was no longer the wealthy who dominated the trade, but messengers, scribes, and intermediaries. Men whose profession was not judgment, but speed. They carried news from tavern to tavern, auction to auction, their value measured by how quickly they could spread excitement. This detail matters, because when information becomes currency, truth becomes optional. The Dutch called it wind handle, trading in the wind. Many of the most aggressive speculators never touched a bulb. They never planned to. Their entire strategy depended on movement, not ownership. They bought contracts in the morning and sold them by nightfall. The tulip was irrelevant. It was merely the excuse that allowed desire to circulate. The real asset was attention. And attention, once captured, behaves like fire. You must understand the psychology of this moment. These people were not stupid. The Dutch Republic was one of the most literate societies on earth. Account books were meticulous, contracts precise, and yet, something older than logic took control. When price rises quickly, the human brain stops asking why and begins asking how much more. At this stage, doubt feels immoral. To question the tulip was to question your neighbor's intelligence, your cousin's judgment, your own past decisions. The cave punishes dissent not with violence, but with isolation. So most chose silence, or worse, participation. There are records of sailors pawning their tools, of farmers selling livestock in winter, of dowries converted into paper promises signed by candlelight. These are not anecdotes told to mock. They are warnings. Because illusion does not announce itself as illusion. It arrives dressed as opportunity. Behind it all, the bulbs remained buried. This is the detail historians often overlook. The market had detached entirely from the physical world. The tulips could not be inspected, could not be verified, could not even be admired. They existed only as descriptions, names, and stories. Admirals of admirals, viceroy, general of generals. Names grand enough to distract from absence. The cave was complete. And then, without drama, the fire dimmed. It began with a single auction in Haarlem where buyers failed to appear. Not because they understood the risk, but because they hesitated. That hesitation spread like cold. Sellers arrived, buyers delayed. Delays became doubts. Doubts became absence. And absence is fatal to shadows. Within weeks, prices collapsed. Not gradually. Evaporated. Contracts written in confidence were suddenly treated as jokes. Courts refused enforcement, labeling the agreements gambling rather than trade. The same society that celebrated the mania now disowned it. This, too, is important. When the cave collapses, no one claims authorship. Those who had turned their lives into reflections were left staring at stone. Now listen carefully. This is where the lesson sharpens. The collapse did not destroy the Dutch economy. Trade continued. Ships sailed. Wealth was rebuilt. But the individuals who had mistaken projection for substance were marked. Not publicly, but internally. Some recovered. Many did not. The pain was not merely financial. It was existential. To realize you had confused belief with truth is a wound to identity. This is why most people prefer to remain chained. The deeper philosophy of the cave is not ignorance. It is attachment. Attachment to being right. Attachment to belonging. Attachment to the comfort of agreement. The prisoners defend the shadows because the shadows validate their place in the world. In financial terms, this attachment manifests as narrative dependence. Investors fall in love with stories. Stories of innovation. Stories of revolution. Stories of inevitability. The story becomes the asset. And once that happens, price no longer reflects value. It reflects conviction. But conviction is weightless. True value has mass. It resists gravity. It persists when attention moves elsewhere. The tulip had beauty, but it did not have endurance as a store of wealth. Its utility did not scale with price. Its production could not justify valuation. These questions were never asked because the wall was too bright. Here, by the fire, we can ask them calmly. What creates cash flow? What endures across cycles? What remains when excitement fades? These are not exciting questions. They do not sparkle. They do not trend, which is precisely why they matter. The few who avoided ruin during the mania were not prophets. They were oriented differently. They did not stare at the wall. They watched behavior. They noticed when trade detached from substance. They sensed when prices began to feed on themselves. And quietly, without speeches or warnings, they stepped back. This is the posture of freedom. Not certainty, but humility. Not speed, but patience. Not reaction, but observation. As we move forward, remember this image. A frozen field, bulbs buried deep, taverns roaring with confidence above them. The cave is always louder than reality, but reality is always heavier. We are only beginning to turn our heads. There is a silence that follows every illusion once it breaks. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of people avoiding one another's eyes. In Amsterdam, after the collapse, taverns emptied, conversations shortened. The same men who once spoke endlessly of futures and fortunes now spoke of weather, of ships, of anything that did not remind them of what they had believed together. Memory itself became dangerous, because memory asks questions. And questions lead back to the wall. What fascinates me most is not the mania, but what came after. The reckoning did not arrive as punishment from the heavens. No plague descended. No foreign army invaded. Life continued, which made the realization unbearable. The pain was not imposed. It was internal. People had to live with the knowledge that nothing external had forced them to act. They had chosen the shadows. This is the part most financial histories avoid. They tally losses, list dates, name prices, but they do not sit with the human cost of disillusionment, the loss of trust in one's own judgment, the erosion of confidence that follows realizing you were not unlucky, but misoriented. Because once you see that, the cave changes forever. Some people hardened. They vowed never to speculate again, mistaking caution for wisdom. Others doubled down in future manias, chasing redemption through repetition. But a very small number did something else. They began to study behavior instead of objects. They asked not what people were buying, but why they were buying it. They learned to listen for urgency, for moral language around profit, for phrases like "everyone knows" and "you cannot lose." These people became quieter. They stopped announcing intentions. They stopped seeking agreement. They understood something profound, that the most dangerous moments in markets are not when prices fall, but when certainty becomes widespread, when disagreement feels rude, when skepticism feels outdated, when the cave rewards obedience with applause. This is where Plato's cave becomes more than metaphor. The prisoners do not merely see shadows, they build identities around them. Careers, reputations, entire social hierarchies depend on maintaining the illusion. And when someone turns their head, the reaction is not curiosity. It is hostility. Think of the few who warned during Tulip Mania. They were ignored, mocked, sometimes accused of jealousy or ignorance, because to question the shadow is to threaten the social order built around it. This is why truth is rarely welcomed in real time. It arrives early, alone, and inconvenient. Now let us turn gently toward the financial lesson, without breaking the spell. Markets are not machines. They are mirrors. They reflect human psychology amplified by capital. When attention concentrates, prices move. When attention disperses, prices fall. Value, however, moves slowly, often invisibly. Like the tulip bulb beneath frozen ground, it develops in silence. The tragedy of most investors is not lack of intelligence, but lack of patience. They want feedback immediately. They want confirmation now. Shadows provide this. They flicker constantly. They respond to every movement. They make you feel involved. Real value does not behave this way. It grows quietly. It compounds without drama. It often feels boring until suddenly it feels obvious. By the time it feels obvious, it is usually too late. This is why the disciplined investor feels lonely. They are often early, which feels identical to being wrong. They resist narratives, which makes them unpopular. They wait while others celebrate, and they act when others panic. This is not courage. It is orientation. Returning to the cave one last time, notice something subtle. The prisoners are not chained because someone fears their strength. They are chained because someone understands their attention. Control the fire, and you control the wall. Control the wall, and you guide behavior without force. In modern markets, the fire is information flow, news cycles, analyst upgrades, social sentiment, speed. The faster the fire moves, the harder it is to see its source, and the more people mistake motion for meaning. Your task is not to escape information. It is to slow it, to create distance between stimulus and action, to ask, quietly, what exists independent of excitement? What produces cash flow? What endures across cycles? What you would still own if no one talked about it for years? These questions do not trend. They do not entertain. They do not belong in taverns filled with shouting voices. They belong in quiet rooms, late at night, where decisions are made without witnesses. The lesson of the tulips is not that speculation is evil. It is that speculation untethered from reality becomes theater. And theater, no matter how convincing, cannot sustain wealth. We are closer to the wall than most realize, but we are also closer to the fire. And proximity brings choice. In the next part, we will examine how the illusion evolves, how shadows learn to speak, and how narratives themselves become assets traded at scale. Do you want me to continue with the next part? There is a final layer to this story, one that reveals why the cave is so difficult to leave even after it has collapsed. After the tulip market unraveled, the Dutch did not ban speculation. They did not outlaw futures. They did not retreat from trade. Instead, they normalized the event. They reduced it to a curiosity, a brief madness, a lesson learned and safely archived. This is how societies protect themselves from shame, by shrinking the meaning of their own illusions. But the structure that allowed the mania to form remained intact. Merchants still gathered. Contracts were still written. Confidence still traveled faster than goods. The same mechanisms that had projected tulips onto the wall quietly repositioned themselves, waiting for the next object worthy of belief. Because the cave is not sustained by any single asset. It is sustained by a pattern of attention. This is where most people misunderstand financial history. They search for villains. They want manipulators, conspirators, puppet masters. These exist, of course, but they are secondary. The primary engine of illusion is participation. Shadows require viewers. Without eyes, the wall is blank. During the mania, many traders privately suspected excess. Letters survive in which men confessed unease, even dread. And yet they continued, not because they believed completely, but because exiting felt riskier than staying. This is the most dangerous psychological threshold, when belief is no longer required, only momentum. Once a system reaches this stage, collapse becomes inevitable, not because it is wrong, but because it has lost its anchor. Price floats freely, untethered from reality, sustained only by the assumption that someone else will arrive tomorrow and believe harder. This is not an economic flaw. It is a human one. We are social creatures. We calibrate our understanding of reality through others. This trait keeps tribes alive, but it also traps individuals in shared hallucinations. The cave works because it feels communal. Leaving it feels like exile. This is why true financial independence is not primarily about money. It is about psychological separation, the ability to stand apart from collective urgency, to tolerate being early, to endure long periods where your choices produce no applause. Let me tell you something rarely said aloud. Most people do not fail financially because they lack discipline. They fail because they cannot endure emotional solitude. They cannot watch others celebrate without joining. They cannot remain still while the room buzzes. They confuse silence with stagnation. The disciplined investor learns to listen for silence. In the years following Tulip Mania, Dutch wealth did not disappear. It consolidated. Capital flowed back into ships, trade routes, infrastructure, quiet enterprises that did not require daily excitement. These investments did not make tavern legends. They built empires. This distinction matters. Because wealth built in shadows demands constant attention. Wealth built on substance compounds unattended. Ask yourself this: if you had to stop checking prices for 5 years, what would you still want to own? If no one praised your choice, would it still make sense? If the story vanished, would the cash flow remain? These questions are uncomfortable. They strip away illusion. They force you to confront whether you are investing or participating in theater. The cave is seductive because it offers identity. You are not just a person. You are a trader, an early adopter, an insider. Leaving the cave means surrendering these labels. It means becoming ordinary in appearance, even as your internal clarity grows extraordinary. Plato understood this. The freed prisoner does not rush back to save others. He hesitates. He knows that truth spoken too early sounds like madness. That clarity threatens those still chained. That the cave will defend itself. This is why wisdom moves slowly. As you listen, notice your own reactions. Where you feel agreement. Where you feel resistance. Where you feel the urge to argue, or to apply this lesson immediately to something you already believe in. That urge is the cave asserting itself. It wants you to project this insight outward, not inward. Resist that. The purpose of this chapter is not to make you cynical. It is to make you precise, to teach you to distinguish movement from meaning, price from value, noise from signal, to help you see that markets are not puzzles to be solved, but environments to be navigated with humility. The tulips are long gone, but their shadows remain. They flicker every day, in new forms, with new names, dressed in modern language, and they will continue because they are not anomalies. They are expressions of a permanent human vulnerability. The good news is this: once you recognize the wall, it loses much of its power. You may still see shadows, but you no longer mistake them for the source. You may still feel temptation, but you understand its mechanics. You become harder to move, harder to frighten, harder to herd. This is the beginning of real freedom. In the next part, we will complete this chapter by turning fully toward the fire, by examining how to cultivate intrinsic value thinking, how to remain solvent while others chase illusions, and how to build wealth that survives silence. Now we turn fully, not abruptly, but deliberately, toward the fire. The mistake many make at this point is to believe that seeing the illusion is enough. It is not. Recognition without discipline only creates a new shadow, the shadow of superiority. The market is unforgiving to those who think awareness alone grants immunity. What protects you is not insight, but structure. Consider what the most resilient Dutch fortunes did after the mania faded from conversation. They did not retreat into fear. They reoriented their questions. Instead of asking what might rise fastest, they asked what would endure longest. Instead of chasing excitement, they cultivated ownership. Ships that carried goods regardless of fashion. Warehouses that stored value quietly. Trade routes that functioned in boom and famine alike. Their wealth grew slowly enough to be ignored and steadily enough to become permanent. This is intrinsic value thinking. Intrinsic value is not a number you calculate once. It is a relationship you maintain over time. It asks whether an asset can justify its existence without applause, whether it can survive boredom, whether it produces something tangible, repeatable, and resilient in the absence of attention. The tulip could not, and this was visible, if one was willing to look away from the wall. Intrinsic value thinking requires 3 disciplines, none of them glamorous. The first is temporal distance. You must extend your time horizon beyond the crowd's patience. Most people cannot think past the next season, the next quarter, the next headline. The longer your horizon, the fewer competitors you face. Shadows move quickly. Substance moves slowly. The second is emotional neutrality. You do not need to be emotionless, but you must be ungoverned by emotion. Excitement and fear are signals, not commands. They tell you where attention is concentrated, not where value resides. When emotion spikes, observation must replace action. The third is selective ignorance. This sounds dangerous, but it is essential. You must consciously ignore most information, not because it is false, but because it is irrelevant. The fire thrives on constant input. Turning toward it means narrowing your field of vision until only what matters remains. This is how you remain solvent while others chase illusions. Solvency is not merely having money. It is having the capacity to wait, to endure periods where your assets do nothing visible, to remain psychologically intact when others appear to prosper faster. Most failures occur not from bad decisions, but from abandoning good ones too early. The tulip traders could not wait. Their positions required constant belief. The moment belief faltered, everything unraveled. This is the fragility of shadow-based wealth. It demands perpetual participation. It collapses the instant attention drifts. Contrast this with wealth built on production, on enterprises that generate cash flow independent of sentiment, on ownership that compounds quietly. This wealth does not need defense. It does not need persuasion. It does not need constant affirmation. It simply continues. Here is a question that will unsettle you, and it should. If markets closed tomorrow and remained closed for a decade, what would still be valuable? What would still function? What would still produce? Most people have never asked this, because asking it forces them to confront how much of their strategy depends on the cave remaining brightly lit, on someone else always being willing to buy the shadow. The disciplined investor prepares for silence. This does not mean avoiding risk. It means choosing risks that reward patience rather than attention. Risks where time is an ally, not an enemy. Risks that do not require perfect timing, only reasonable judgment sustained. By now, you should feel the shift. We began with a flower and a frenzy. We end with posture and perspective. This is intentional, because the cave is not escaped through rebellion, but through reorientation. You do not smash the wall. You stop mistaking it for reality. Let me speak plainly, as one would by a fire. Late, when pretense has worn thin, you will always see shadows. Markets will always move. Narratives will always form. The goal is not to become immune, but to become discerning. To know when you are watching reflections and when you are observing sources. To know when to act and when to remain still. The tulips taught a civilization this lesson at great cost. You have the advantage of distance, of history, of pattern recognition. Use it. As we leave this chapter, carry one image with you. A frozen field, bulbs buried deep, taverns loud with certainty above them. Ask yourself, quietly, where value truly lived in that moment. Then ask where it lives now. We have completed our first turn of the head. The wall is no longer all you see. In the chapters ahead, the illusions will grow more sophisticated, the shadows more articulate, but so will your sight. The fire is behind us. The exit remains ahead. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone knows something is wrong, yet no one is willing to be the first to say it. The court of the emperor was filled with silk and gold, with polished floors that reflected candlelight like still water. Courtiers moved carefully, not out of reverence, but calculation. Every gesture was measured, every word weighed. Because in this court, reality was not what was seen. Reality was what could be safely acknowledged. When the weavers arrived, they did not look like con artists. That is the first detail worth remembering. They looked like experts. Their hands were steady, their voices calm. They spoke in the language of mastery. They claimed to weave a fabric so refined, so intelligent, that it could not be seen by those unfit for their positions. Only the worthy could perceive it. Only the competent. Only the legitimate. This was not magic. It was psychology. The emperor listened, intrigued not by the cloth, but by the test it implied. A robe that separated the capable from the unworthy. A mirror that revealed truth without confrontation. He did not ask how such a fabric could exist. He asked who would fail to see it. And in that question, the cave sealed itself. The looms were set. The weavers mimed their work, hands moving through empty air, describing textures with poetic precision. Those sent to inspect the progress felt their stomachs tighten. They saw nothing, not a thread, not a shimmer. But the cost of honesty was immediate and personal. To admit blindness was to admit unfitness. And so they praised the invisible cloth. Word spread quickly, not of doubt, but of admiration. Each person borrowed confidence from the last. The illusion did not grow stronger because it was convincing. It grew stronger because it was shared. By the time the emperor stood before the mirror, the entire court was invested. To see nothing was to stand alone against a room full of agreement. So he did what most people do when reality threatens identity. He adjusted his posture and pretended. The procession that followed was magnificent. Trumpets sounded. Citizens lined the streets. And here, something even more unsettling occurred. The people, too, said nothing. Some out of fear, some out of confusion, some because everyone else seemed to see something they did not. And so the emperor walked naked through his city, wrapped in a collective lie so dense it felt like truth, until a child spoke. The child did not break the illusion because children are brave. He broke it because he had no reputation to defend, no position to lose, no identity tied to the shadow. He simply described what was there, or rather, what was not. This story survives not because it is clever, but because it is accurate. It captures something timeless and uncomfortable, that entire systems of intelligent adults can maintain an illusion long after its emptiness is obvious, not because they are deceived, but because they are afraid of the consequences of seeing clearly. This is the myth. Sit with it. Now, let us step deeper, where the philosophy breathes. The invisible robe is not about clothing. It is about social proof, about the way human perception bends under collective agreement. When enough people affirm something, the brain stops asking whether it is true and begins asking whether it is safe to disagree. This is the hidden law of the cave. Truth is not rejected because it is false. It is rejected because it threatens belonging. Plato understood this. So did Socrates. So did every thinker who died unpopular. The majority does not rule by force. It rules by normalization, by making dissent feel abnormal, embarrassing, dangerous. The cave does not chain you physically. It trains you emotionally. In markets, this manifests as consensus reality. When analysts agree, when headlines align, when dissenting voices are dismissed as outdated, ignorant, or bitter, at that point, the robe is already invisible. People praise valuations they cannot justify. They repeat narratives they do not understand. They call confidence insight and doubt stupidity. The emperor does not ask whether the robe exists. He asks whether anyone else sees it. And when everyone nods, the question feels settled. But markets, like children, do not care about dignity. The philosophy here is not cynicism. It is humility. To recognize how easily perception can be outsourced, how quickly we adopt beliefs to protect our status, how dangerous it is to tie identity to agreement. Now, gently, we begin to move toward finance. The most dangerous investments are not the riskiest. They are the most socially validated, the ones everyone owns, the ones praised not for cash flow or durability, but for inevitability. When an asset becomes a test of intelligence rather than a question of value, you are no longer investing. You are performing. And performance requires an audience. In the next part, we will examine how modern markets manufacture invisible robes, how expertise itself becomes a prop, and how entire generations learn to applaud what they cannot see. For now, sit with the image: a naked emperor, a silent crowd, and one small voice telling the truth without agenda. After the child spoke, the procession did not stop. This detail is often forgotten. The crowd did not scatter. The emperor did not flee. The lie did not collapse instantly. It wavered. It thinned. But it persisted long enough to reveal something far more unsettling than deception itself. that illusions do not die when exposed. They die when people decide the cost of maintaining them exceeds the cost of letting them go. In the original telling by Hans Christian Andersen, the emperor continues walking. His cheeks burn. His spine stiffens. He knows. Everyone knows. And still, the ceremony moves forward, because by that point, the illusion is no longer about the robe. It is about dignity, about saving face, about finishing what has already begun. This is how most market manias end, not with a scream, but with a slow procession. People remain invested not because they believe, but because retreat feels humiliating. The sunk cost is not only financial, it is psychological. To exit is to admit blindness. To admit blindness is to risk social standing. And for most, that cost feels unbearable. So they walk on. The deeper philosophy here is not that people are liars. It is that they are identity protectors. Once a belief becomes public, it becomes personal. Once it becomes personal, it becomes defended. This is why consensus hardens over time, not because evidence improves, but because reversal becomes expensive. Notice how the weavers operated. They never claimed the robe was beautiful. They claimed it was selective. This is crucial. They did not sell fabric. They sold status. The inability to see the robe was framed as a personal failure. And when perception is moralized, truth becomes dangerous. Modern markets use the same mechanism. Certain assets are not merely investments. They are symbols. To own them is to signal intelligence, progress, alignment with the future. To question them is to risk being labeled backward, fearful, uninformed. And so people nod. They praise what they do not understand. They repeat phrases that sound convincing. They outsource judgment to the room. The cave does not require force when shame will do. There is a moment in every speculative cycle when valuation detaches from explanation, when people stop asking what generates returns and start asking who still doubts. At that moment, the invisible robe is complete. The market no longer rewards analysis. It rewards conformity. Let me speak carefully here. Experts are not villains. Most believe what they say. But expertise, when unchallenged, becomes costume. Credentials replace curiosity. Authority replaces inquiry. And the more prestigious the speaker, the harder it becomes to admit uncertainty. This is why bubbles often grow fastest under expert supervision. Analysts compete not to be correct, but to be early together. Fund managers fear underperforming peers more than losing money absolutely. Institutions prefer shared error to solitary accuracy. Because shared error preserves reputation, solitary accuracy threatens it. This is the Emperor's Court reborn. The spiritual insight beneath all of this is sobering. Humans do not seek truth. They seek coherence. They want their beliefs to align with their environment, to feel at home in their understanding. The cave provides this. It offers a stable narrative reinforced by others. Leaving it introduces dissonance, and dissonance feels like danger. But clarity lives on the other side of discomfort. To cultivate it, one must develop a very specific discipline. The discipline of private doubt. Not performative skepticism, not public contrarianism, but quiet questioning conducted away from the crowd. The ability to say, to oneself, "I do not see it," without rushing to borrow someone else's sight. This is harder than it sounds, because doubt is lonely. It offers no immediate reward. It does not produce applause. It simply sits, unresolved, until understanding arrives or opportunity passes. Most people cannot tolerate this. They prefer borrowed certainty to personal uncertainty. Now we turn, gently, toward finance. The most dangerous phrase in investing is "everyone agrees." When consensus becomes a selling point, valuation is no longer the driver. Social validation is. At that stage, prices are not anchored to cash flow, durability, or productivity. They are anchored to belief, and belief, unlike value, can evaporate overnight. The disciplined investor listens for unanimity the way sailors listen for silence before a storm. When dissent disappears, risk concentrates. When questions vanish, fragility increases. The invisible robe feels heaviest just before it vanishes. This does not mean you must oppose the crowd at every turn. That is another illusion. The goal is not opposition. It is independence. To know why you own what you own. To articulate its value without reference to popularity. To remain comfortable being misunderstood. In the next part, we will move fully into application. How to recognize invisible robes in modern markets. How to test whether you are seeing substance or performance. And how to cultivate the courage to trust your own sight without becoming arrogant. For now, remember this. The child did not shout. He did not argue. He simply stated what was there. And what was there changed everything. When the procession finally ended and the streets emptied, something irreversible had happened. Even those who never admitted it carried the image home with them. The memory of absence where splendor was promised. The sensation of applauding nothing. From that day forward, the court could never fully trust its own reflections again. The mirror had betrayed them, or rather, they had betrayed themselves through it. This is how illusions leave scars. Not on balance sheets, but on confidence. In markets, these scars take a particular form. They do not make people wiser. They make them cautious in the wrong ways. After exposure, many vow never to be fooled again, yet they rarely change how they decide. They merely change what they applaud. They stop trusting one robe and wait for another, often more sophisticated, more carefully tailored to their fears. Because illusion evolves. The next robe is never identical to the last. It learns. It speaks the language of prudence. It dresses itself in data. It borrows legitimacy from institutions. It offers complexity as camouflage. And once again, people find themselves nodding, not because they see clearly, but because they do not want to be the only one who does not. This is the deeper tragedy of the cave. Exposure alone does not liberate. Orientation does. The philosophical law at work here is subtle. Humans do not change behavior after being wrong. They change behavior after understanding why they were wrong. Without that understanding, they merely replace one consensus with another, one robe with a newer fabric. True seeing requires detachment from identity. As long as your sense of worth depends on being perceived as intelligent, informed, or early, you are vulnerable. Because illusions do not target ignorance. They target ego. They whisper, "This proves you belong among the capable. This confirms you are not like the others." And when belonging is at stake, perception bends. The emperor did not fear nakedness. He feared illegitimacy. The courtiers did not fear lying. They feared exclusion. The crowd did not fear absurdity. They feared standing alone. These are not flaws. They are features of being human. But features can be exploited. In financial markets, the exploitation is systematic. Consider how modern narratives form. A new asset emerges. It is complex enough to intimidate, abstract enough to defy simple explanation. Early adopters profit, or appear to. Experts frame it as inevitable. Skeptics are labeled slow. Soon, not owning it feels like a confession of inadequacy. At this point, questions disappear. Not because answers exist, but because asking feels unsafe. This is when valuation becomes ceremonial. People stop asking what generates returns and start asking who still doubts. They no longer evaluate assets. They evaluate each other. Ownership becomes a badge. Selling becomes a moral failure. And the invisible robe is once again paraded through the streets, until reality, indifferent and patient, intervenes. Reality does not argue. It simply withholds support. Cash flows disappoint. Adoption slows. Margins compress. Something fails quietly. And suddenly, people begin to see. Not all at once. First, privately. Then, in whispers. Then, through excuses. Finally, through exits. The illusion dissolves. And once again, the crowd wonders how it could have happened. Here is the practical application, spoken calmly, without urgency. You must separate reputation from returns. If an investment only makes sense because respected people endorse it, you do not understand it. If you cannot explain its value without referencing popularity, you are wearing the robe. If selling feels like social betrayal rather than rational adjustment, you are not managing risk. You are managing identity. The disciplined investor builds a private framework, one that does not require consensus, one that can withstand disagreement, one that allows you to say, "I do not see it yet," and wait without shame. This framework asks simple questions repeatedly. What produces value? What consumes capital? What assumptions must remain true for success? What breaks first if conditions change? These questions are dull. They do not impress. They do not trend, which is precisely why they protect you. When the crowd applauds loudly, lower your voice. When certainty fills the room, widen your distance. When disagreement vanishes, sharpen your scrutiny. These are not tactics. They are postures. Let me be clear. This does not guarantee profit. Nothing does. But it dramatically reduces self-inflicted loss. It keeps you from applauding nothing. It keeps you from mistaking silence for ignorance and noise for truth. The child in the story did not overthrow the emperor. He did not claim authority. He simply refused to pretend. That refusal changed the geometry of the room. Suddenly, seeing became possible. You do not need to be a hero. You do not need to announce your clarity. You only need to stop applauding what you cannot see. As we close this chapter, carry this with you. Markets will always produce robes. Some crude, some exquisite, some woven with numbers so convincing they feel solid. Your task is not to mock them, nor to chase them, but to test them quietly, away from the crowd. In the next chapter, the shadows will learn to speak in riddles. Truth will hide behind ambiguity, and certainty will be sold as wisdom. The cave grows more sophisticated. So must your sight. The path to Delphi wound upward through stone and silence, past olive trees twisted by wind and age. Pilgrims climbed it with offerings pressed to their chests, hearts heavy with questions they could not answer alone. Kings came disguised as commoners. Generals came before marching. Merchants came before risking fleets. All sought the same thing: certainty. At the summit stood the Temple of Apollo, white against the mountain, severe and radiant. Inside, the air smelled of laurel and earth. A fissure split the ground beneath the sanctuary, breathing vapors said to carry the voice of the god. Upon a tripod above it sat the Pythia, the oracle, veiled and distant, her words drifting like smoke. What made Delphi powerful was not prophecy. It was ambiguity. The Pythia did not shout truths. She murmured riddles. Her answers bent language without breaking it. When King Croesus of Lydia asked whether he should wage war against Persia, the oracle replied that if he did, a great empire would fall. Encouraged, he marched. He lost everything. The empire that fell was his own. The oracle had not lied. This detail is essential. Delphi survived for centuries, not because it predicted outcomes, but because it protected itself from falsification. The words were always true after the fact. Interpretation carried the burden. Responsibility shifted quietly from the speaker to the listener. The cave refined itself. People did not come to Delphi to learn the future. They came to outsource doubt. To stand before the oracle was to relieve oneself of the agony of choice. Once the words were spoken, action felt justified. Failure could be reframed as misunderstanding. Success could be claimed as foresight. Either way, the authority remained intact. This is the ancient geometry of prediction. The spiritual law beneath it is uncomfortable. Humans crave certainty more than accuracy. Ambiguity, when wrapped in authority, feels wiser than clarity. It allows us to project our desires while believing we are obeying something higher. The oracle did not control kings. Kings controlled themselves through belief. Plato understood this danger. So did those who warned against divination. When guidance becomes fog, power flows to the interpreter. And most interpreters hear what they want. In the cave, smoke is more effective than chains. Now, let us turn gently, because the parallel to modern finance is exact. Today's oracles do not sit above fissures. They sit behind desks, on panels, in studios bathed in soft light. They speak with confidence, calibrated just enough to sound profound without being pinned down. Forecasts arrive hedged with conditions. Targets shift. Timelines blur. When outcomes fail, explanations multiply. The prophecy was right. Circumstances changed. This is not deception. It is theater. Markets reward those who sound certain, even when certainty is impossible. Precision is punished. Humility is ignored. Ambiguity, delivered with authority, commands attention. Investors do not ask for truth. They ask for reassurance. They want to believe their path is sanctioned. The oracle obliges. The danger here is subtle. Predictions do not need to be wrong to be harmful. They only need to replace preparation with expectation. When you believe the future has been spoken, you stop building resilience. You stop asking, "What if?" You act as if the smoke itself were solid ground. Croesus did not lose because he misheard. He lost because he mistook permission for protection. The disciplined investor learns a different lesson from Delphi. Not that forecasts are useless, but that they must be stripped of authority. A prediction is a story about a possible future, not a guarantee of outcome. When treated as such, it can inform. When treated as destiny, it enslaves. Here is the practical application, spoken quietly. Never act on a forecast without asking what breaks if it is wrong. Never commit capital that cannot survive ambiguity. Never let someone else's conviction replace your own contingency planning. The future is not a single path. It is a field of probabilities shaped by forces no oracle can command. The wise do not ask, "What will happen?" They ask, "What will I do if it does?" This is how you step out of the smoke. As we leave Delphi behind, remember the mountain, the vapors, the riddles that felt like wisdom. Remember that kings fell not because the oracle lied, but because they surrendered judgment. The cave grows more refined as knowledge advances. Shadows become articulate. Smoke learns to speak. In the next part, we will examine how ambiguity becomes an asset, how uncertainty is packaged and sold, and how to build a framework that thrives without prophecy. What made the oracle enduring was not insight, but insulation. Every answer preserved its own escape. Every sentence bent just enough to survive contradiction. And because of this, the oracle never faced accountability. The burden of interpretation always fell on the listener. This is the quiet genius of ambiguity. It transfers responsibility without appearing to do so. The pilgrim leaves believing he has been guided, when in truth he has merely been licensed. This is why ambiguity feels sacred. It allows the mind to participate in its own persuasion. When words are unclear, desire rushes in to complete them. Hope fills the gaps. Fear sharpens the edges. And whatever outcome arrives later can be retrofitted to match the prophecy. The smoke always looks intentional in hindsight. There is something deeply comforting about this. To believe that events unfold according to hidden design rather than chance. To believe that suffering has meaning, that loss was foretold, that success was earned through obedience to signs. The oracle offers not control, but consolation. And consolation is addictive. The cave evolves here. Shadows no longer need to be vivid. They need only to be suggestive. A half shape is more powerful than a full one because it invites participation. The prisoners are no longer passive viewers. They become co-creators of the illusion. Modern markets have perfected this art. Listen carefully to how predictions are framed. Not in absolutes, but in ranges. Not in commitments, but in scenarios. If growth continues, if conditions remain favorable, if external shocks are contained, these phrases are not dishonest. They are cautious. But caution, when paired with authority, creates a strange effect. It sounds responsible while still encouraging belief. Investors hear what they want. They translate possibility into probability, probability into expectation, expectation into entitlement. And entitlement is where risk hides. The psychological law at work is simple. The more uncertain the future, the more people seek those who speak confidently about it. Not accurately, confidently. This is why forecasts cluster, why targets converge, why dissent sounds irresponsible. The oracle's power grows when anxiety rises, but certainty does not reduce risk. It merely blinds you to it. The wise understand this instinct and resist it. They do not ask for answers where none can exist. They build systems instead. Systems that do not require foresight, only resilience. Systems that assume error. Systems that remain functional when assumptions fail. This is the difference between prophecy and preparation. The oracle offers a single path. Preparation offers many exits. In financial terms, this means constructing positions that survive multiple futures, avoiding leverage that demands precision, refusing timelines that punish patience, diversifying not to maximize returns, but to minimize fragility. These choices feel conservative. They feel slow. They feel unsophisticated. Until the smoke clears. Then they feel obvious. Most people misunderstand risk. They imagine it as volatility, as movement, as visible danger. But the most dangerous risks are invisible. They are embedded in assumptions, in forecasts treated as facts, in models that work beautifully until they do not. The oracle never warned of this, because warning would dissolve the spell. The disciplined investor learns to treat all predictions as weather reports, not maps. Useful for preparation, dangerous for navigation. You carry an umbrella because rain is possible, not because it is promised. You do not build your house on a forecast. Here, the cave offers a final temptation. To believe that rejecting prediction makes you wiser. It does not. Rejecting prediction without replacing it with structure leaves you reactive. You will still respond to events as they unfold, only without preparation. This is not clarity. It is drift. True clarity accepts uncertainty and plans anyway. It asks not what will happen, but what could happen, and whether survival depends on guessing correctly. If it does, the strategy is flawed. If it does not, the strategy gains strength with time. This is how you walk past the oracle without kneeling. As we prepare to leave Delphi behind, notice how the smoke lingers even after the words fade. Notice how tempting it is to replay them, to reinterpret, to find meaning. that temptation does not disappear. It must be managed. In the next part, we will complete this chapter by grounding ambiguity into action, by examining how to operate without prophecy, how to read signals without surrendering to them, and how to build wealth that does not require permission from the future. When pilgrims descended from Delphi, they rarely spoke of the climb. They spoke of the words, of how they sounded, of how they lingered. Some repeated them aloud as if repetition might clarify meaning. Others kept them secret, fearing that exposure would weaken their power. But all carried the same burden: interpretation. The oracle had spoken, yes, but the future remained stubbornly unwritten. This is where the true danger lived, because once a prophecy enters the mind, it reshapes perception. Every event becomes evidence. Every coincidence feels intentional. Losses are reframed as tests, delays as signs. The oracle becomes a lens through which reality is filtered. And slowly, without realizing it, the pilgrim stops observing the world directly. He observes it through expectation. Markets work the same way. Once you accept a forecast, you begin to notice only what confirms it. You interpret data selectively. You excuse contradictions. You grow patient when you should be cautious, or stubborn when you should adapt. The prediction becomes a silent partner in every decision, whispering reassurance or urging haste. This is how people become trapped by narratives they did not create. The disciplined mind treats ambiguity differently. It does not rush to resolve it. It allows uncertainty to remain unresolved without anxiety. This is rare. Most people experience uncertainty as discomfort that must be eliminated. The oracle offers relief, but relief is not resolution. True strength is the capacity to operate without emotional closure. This is the spiritual discipline beneath financial independence. To accept that the future will not explain itself in advance. To stop seeking permission from authority. To stand in not knowing without panic. Plato warned against this reliance on external guidance. When knowledge is outsourced, agency erodes. When agency erodes, responsibility follows. The cave does not only blind, it infantilizes. In financial life, this infantilization appears as dependency on analysts, on forecasts, on institutions that promise to interpret complexity on your behalf. Complexity is real, but surrendering understanding is optional. Let me speak plainly. No one knows what will happen next. Anyone who claims otherwise is either mistaken or selling comfort. The goal is not to predict correctly. It is to remain solvent, flexible, and psychologically intact across outcomes. This is where preparation replaces prophecy. Preparation asks different questions. What assumptions am I making? Which of them are fragile? How much error can this position tolerate? What would force me to act under pressure? What am I ignoring because it complicates the story? These questions do not produce certainty. They produce resilience. The oracle never asked these questions because they would have revealed the emptiness of smoke. Modern investors must ask them constantly, not once, not ceremonially, but as a habit, a ritual more meaningful than consultation, because habits unlike prophecies, compound. There is a quiet freedom that emerges when you no longer seek to know the future. You stop reacting to every whisper. You stop flinching at every headline. You begin to see patterns without needing conclusions. You build structures that hold regardless of narrative. This is not detachment from reality. It is intimacy with it. You become less impressed by confident voices, less disturbed by uncertainty, more interested in durability than direction. You stop asking whether something will work and start asking whether it must work to survive. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. The oracle fades. The smoke clears. Not because truth arrives, but because you no longer require it to act. You move forward without omens, without signs, without the need for assurance that cannot be delivered. This is how one leaves Delphi. Not by disproving the oracle, but by outgrowing the need to kneel. As we step away from the mountain, the path ahead leads deeper into the cave's architecture, where distraction becomes governance, where spectacle replaces substance, where attention itself is traded like currency. The shadows grow louder there, but by now, you know how to listen without obeying. Rome did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because it learned how to distract itself from truth. The Forum once echoed with arguments about law, land, and duty. Citizens gathered not merely to be entertained, but to be involved. They debated grain prices, military campaigns, the limits of authority. Participation was imperfect, often corrupt, but it required attention. Attention sharpens responsibility. Responsibility restrains decay. As the Republic transformed into empire, something subtle shifted. The questions grew quieter. The answers arrived louder. Free grain was distributed to the masses, not as charity, but as anesthesia. Hunger silenced dissent more effectively than legions. And when food alone no longer satisfied, spectacle followed. Games, races, executions staged as theater. The Colosseum did not exist to entertain. It existed to occupy the mind. Bread fed the body. Mirrors fed the ego. Citizens watched reflections of violence and victory and felt included in power they no longer exercised. They cheered triumphs they did not earn. They identified with heroes who fought for them, so they would not notice that decision-making had drifted far beyond their reach. This was not cruelty. It was strategy. The genius of bread and circuses was not distraction alone. It was substitution. Real agency was replaced with symbolic participation. The people felt present while being absent. They mistook stimulation for involvement. The cave grew larger. This is the myth as history remembers it. But stay with me, because the deeper truth lives beneath the marble. Rome's elite understood something timeless. Attention is finite. Whoever controls it governs perception. And perception, more than force, determines stability. When people are entertained, they stop asking questions. When they stop asking questions, they stop demanding accountability. This is not ancient wisdom. It is permanent. The spiritual law at work here is seduction by comfort. Humans do not surrender freedom for chains. They surrender it for relief, for ease, for the promise that someone else will handle complexity while they enjoy the surface of life. The cave does not imprison through fear alone. It pacifies through pleasure. Now, let us begin the turn, carefully, because this chapter speaks directly to the present. Modern markets are not ruled by bread and circuses. They are ruled by screens and stimulation. Price movements flash constantly. News scrolls endlessly. Opinions multiply faster than facts. The mind is kept busy, so it cannot become discerning. This is not accidental. When information arrives faster than it can be processed, reflection collapses. Reaction replaces thought. People feel informed while understanding less. The cave no longer needs chains. It needs notifications. Consider how financial news is consumed. Headlines shout urgency. Red and green numbers trigger emotion. Commentary fills every pause. There is no silence. And without silence, there is no depth. Rome's citizens did not lose power overnight. They lost it gradually, as attention shifted from governance to entertainment. Modern investors lose agency the same way, not through ignorance, but through saturation. The market becomes a coliseum. Assets become gladiators. Spectators cheer movements they cannot influence. Losses are rationalized as entertainment costs. Wins are celebrated as proof of skill. But beneath it all, ownership slips away. The disciplined investor must see this clearly. The purpose of constant market stimulation is not to inform. It is to provoke action. Action generates volume. Volume generates profit for intermediaries. Stillness generates nothing for those who sell movement. This is the mirror. People are shown endless reflections of activity and mistake it for opportunity. They believe being busy means being effective. They confuse watching with participating. And slowly, they surrender the most valuable asset they possess: attention. Rome's bread dulled hunger. Its games dulled judgment. Modern markets offer both. Easy liquidity dulls risk perception. Endless content dulls independent thought. The cave hums with comfort. Here is the quiet warning, spoken without drama. If your strategy requires constant engagement, it is fragile. If your confidence rises and falls with headlines, it is borrowed. If your sense of progress depends on stimulation, it is theatrical. Real wealth is built in environments that feel boring. It grows where attention is scarce and patience is required. It compounds in silence, not in arenas. In the next part, we will step deeper into this architecture. We will examine how distraction becomes dependency, how noise reshapes behavior, and how those who step away from the spectacle gain an advantage precisely because they are no longer entertained. For now, remember Rome. Remember the cheering crowds. Remember how an empire learned to distract itself into decline. The cave does not collapse loudly. It entertains you while it closes. There is a moment, subtle and easily missed, when distraction stops being a tool and becomes a habitat. In Rome, This moment arrived when citizens no longer remembered what silence felt like. Days were measured by spectacles, weeks by festivals. Time itself became segmented by events designed to fill it. When the games paused, restlessness crept in. Not reflection. Restlessness. The absence of stimulation felt like deprivation. This is how dependence forms. The people did not ask why grain arrived freely. They asked only whether it would continue. They did not ask who paid for the games. They asked who would fight next. Attention had been successfully redirected from structure to sensation, from cause to effect, from governance to glow. Once this shift occurs, power no longer needs to hide. It becomes invisible through irrelevance. This is the deeper mechanism of the cave. When attention is fragmented, responsibility dissolves. When responsibility dissolves, outcomes appear mysterious. People begin to believe that forces beyond comprehension shape their lives. Fate, luck, the market, the gods. And so, control completes its circle. Now listen closely, because this is where the story bends toward you. Modern financial life mirrors Rome with unnerving precision. The average investor is surrounded by stimulation, price alerts, opinion feeds, commentary layered upon commentary. The sensation of being involved is constant. The sensation of understanding is optional. This environment does not encourage thinking. It rewards reacting. When prices move, people feel compelled to act, not because action is necessary, but because inactivity feels like absence, like being left out of the arena. The market becomes something to watch rather than something to own. And ownership, true ownership, requires stillness. Rome trained its citizens to feel powerful through spectacle. Modern markets train participants to feel intelligent through activity. Both are illusions. The spiritual cost is subtle but severe. The mind loses its capacity for depth. Attention becomes shallow, skimming from one stimulus to the next. Long-term thinking feels uncomfortable, even boring. The idea of holding something quietly for years feels archaic, primitive. And yet, this is precisely where advantage lives. Distraction is not neutral. It shapes behavior. When you are constantly stimulated, you shorten your time horizon. You favor quick feedback. You demand validation. You grow intolerant of uncertainty. And markets, sensing this impatience, offer instruments designed to exploit it. Leverage, speed, constant liquidity, the illusion of control. But control cannot be exercised in noise. The disciplined investor must reclaim silence deliberately. This is not metaphorical. It is practical. Silence is where signals separate from noise, where decisions regain proportion, where you can observe without being pulled into the arena. This is not withdrawal from reality. It is refusal to be entertained by it. Rome's decline was not caused by bread and games alone. It was caused by the loss of civic vigilance. People stopped watching what mattered. They were watching everything else. In financial terms, this means focusing not on price movement, but on business quality. Not on headlines, but on balance sheets. Not on narratives, but on cash flows. These things do not scream. They do not flash. They require patience. They reward it. The cave thrives on immediacy. Freedom grows in delay. Ask yourself this quietly. How much of what you consume about markets actually changes what you own? How much merely changes how you feel? If information alters emotion without altering strategy, it is entertainment, not insight. Rome's citizens cheered while their influence faded. Many investors do the same, celebrating volatility while surrendering agency. The mirror shows movement. The bread dulls hunger. And slowly, without noticing, ownership becomes performance. In the next part, we will complete this chapter by stepping outside the arena, by examining how those who withdrew from spectacle preserved clarity, capital, and power, by understanding why boredom, properly cultivated, becomes a strategic advantage. For now, let the noise settle. Let the cheering fade. In the quiet that follows, something essential becomes visible. Those who quietly stepped away from the arena were rarely celebrated. In Rome, they were landowners who ignored the games and reinvested in roads, mills, and water. Merchants who refused speculative feasts and focused on supply lines that fed cities when festivals ended. Families who measured prosperity not by applause, but by endurance. Their names did not echo through the Colosseum. Their influence echoed through generations. This pattern repeats wherever distraction becomes dominant. When the crowd gathers, opportunity often disperses. When attention concentrates on spectacle, value migrates elsewhere. This is not coincidence. It is consequence. Capital follows patience the way water follows gravity. It flows toward the lowest emotional temperature. The financial application here is precise. You must separate participation from ownership. Participation is reactive. It responds to movement, commentary, and urgency. It feels active. It feels informed. But it rarely compounds. Ownership is deliberate. It accepts boredom. It tolerates silence. It grows in environments that do not reward constant checking. Ask yourself how often you feel compelled to do something simply because something happened. A price moved. A headline appeared. An opinion went viral. That compulsion is not strategy. It is conditioning. Rome conditioned its citizens to equate spectacle with relevance. Modern markets condition participants to equate activity with intelligence. Both benefit intermediaries. Neither benefits the long-term owner. True ownership requires a different rhythm. It requires choosing assets that do not demand your attention to survive. Businesses that generate cash regardless of sentiment. Systems that improve quietly while others debate loudly. When attention is removed, fragility is exposed. What remains is substance. This is why boredom is misunderstood. Boredom is not the absence of opportunity. It is the absence of stimulation. When stimulation fades, you are left with reality. And reality, unlike spectacle, is unevenly distributed. Those who can endure boredom without inventing excitement gain access to it. This is not easy. The arena will always call you back. With alerts, with stories, with the promise that something important is happening right now. And sometimes it is. But most of the time, it is simply noise recycling itself to justify existence. The disciplined investor learns to ask a single clarifying question. Does this require my attention to create value? If the answer is yes, be cautious. If the answer is no, lean closer. Rome fell when attention drifted from structure to sensation. Investors fail the same way, not through lack of intelligence, but through misplaced focus. They know everything about what is happening today and nothing about what will matter in 10 years. Reversing this does not require brilliance. It requires restraint. You choose fewer inputs. You lengthen your time horizon. You judge success not by excitement, but by resilience. You allow others to cheer while you remain still. This feels uncomfortable at first, like missing out, like irrelevance. Then, slowly, it feels like clarity, because clarity does not shout. It waits. As we leave the arena behind, remember this image. The Colosseum roaring while aqueducts quietly crack. One captures attention. The other sustains civilization. One is remembered. The other makes memory possible. The cave loves mirrors. It thrives on reflection and applause. But beyond it, where silence stretches long and unbroken, ownership regains its meaning. In the next chapter, we will follow money as it abandons spectacle and disguises itself as alchemy. We will watch paper pretend to be gold, belief masquerade as wealth, and see how faith alone can inflate and destroy entire systems. For now, let the crowd cheer. You have other work to do. Long before the modern market learned to dress belief in numbers, there were men who tried to turn faith itself into metal. Paris, early 18th century. The air was heavy with perfume and ambition. France was exhausted by war, its treasury hollowed out by grandeur and conquest. Gold and silver were scarce. Confidence was scarcer. Into this fragile moment stepped a man who understood something most rulers did not. That money is not metal. It is trust. His name was John Law. He was not born into power. He was born into probability. A gambler, a mathematician, a man obsessed with chance and systems, Law believed he had uncovered a hidden mechanism of wealth. That scarcity of money, not scarcity of value, strangled economies. If confidence could be expanded, so could prosperity. And confidence, he believed, could be engineered. Law proposed something radical: paper money. Notes backed not by gold in a vault, but by belief in the future productivity of a nation. Trade would flourish. Debt would dissolve. Growth would accelerate. It sounded like alchemy, because it was. At first, it worked. The Banque Générale issued notes. Commerce surged. The Mississippi Company promised riches from distant lands few had seen. Shares soared. Paris buzzed with optimism. For a moment, it felt as though Law had discovered the philosopher's stone. Paper behaved like gold. Faith behaved like wealth. But something subtle had shifted. Money had detached from restraint. The notes multiplied faster than reality could justify. Speculation replaced enterprise. People did not ask what the Mississippi produced. They asked how fast the shares were rising. The same pattern, different costume. Shadows painted brighter, projected larger, until the wall glowed with promise. Law was not a villain. This is important. He believed in his system, but belief, once amplified, becomes dangerous. Because confidence compounds faster than value. Soon, everyone wanted gold, not to invest, but to escape. Trust reversed direction. The notes that once circulated eagerly were now doubted. And doubt, unlike belief, spreads instantly. When the collapse came, it erased fortunes and faith alike. The alchemist's gold dissolved back into paper, and paper revealed itself for what it always was: a promise. This is where the lesson sharpens. Money is not wealth. It is a claim on wealth. When claims multiply faster than what they claim upon, illusion fills the gap. Leverage disguises fragility. Liquidity mimics abundance. And faith becomes indistinguishable from value. The cave does not care whether the shadow is made of flowers, fabric, prophecy, or paper. It cares only that people face the wall. Here we pause. When the system began to tremble, it did not do so with thunder. It shuddered quietly, like ice thinning beneath a crowd that refuses to look down. At first, only a few noticed. Merchants who asked for redemption in metal rather than notes. Bank clerks who delayed exchanges. Whispers that gold was harder to obtain than the paper that claimed to represent it. These were not panics. They were hesitations. And hesitation is the earliest signal that belief is weakening. John Law responded not with restraint, but with confidence. He merged institutions. He reassured the public. He issued more notes to calm fears, believing that abundance itself would restore trust. This is the fatal instinct of every alchemist. When transformation begins to fail, they add more catalyst. But belief does not obey force. The more paper circulated, the more people sensed that something was wrong. The notes still looked legitimate. They bore seals. They were accepted by decree. Yet something had shifted in the collective gut. Value was no longer felt. It was asserted. This is the moment when illusion becomes dangerous. Because at this stage, the system does not collapse from scarcity. It collapses from excess. Too many promises chasing too little substance. Too much certainty layered upon too little verification. The wall grows brighter, but the fire is thinning. Paris, once euphoric, grew anxious. Prices surged not from prosperity, but from desperation. People bought not because they believed in the future, but because they feared being trapped in paper. Speculation transformed into flight. The cave reversed polarity. Shadows were no longer chased. They were fled. And then, abruptly, confidence broke. The crowd that had once celebrated Law now cursed him. The same voices that praised innovation now demanded punishment. This is always how belief ends. It turns inward. It searches for betrayal. It cannot accept that the system failed because it was believed too deeply. Law fled France disguised as a woman, his fortune gone, his reputation destroyed. But the greater casualty was not his. It was the public's understanding of money itself. For generations, the French distrusted paper currency, not because it was inherently flawed, but because they had witnessed belief run ahead of reality. Here is the deeper philosophy, spoken softly. Faith can create motion, but it cannot create substance. Trust can accelerate exchange, but it cannot replace production. When symbols multiply faster than what they symbolize, fragility grows invisible. The alchemist's error was not imagination. It was hubris, the belief that systems could override human limits, that confidence alone could sustain value indefinitely. This belief appears modern. It is not. It is ancient. Every era rediscovers it. The financial application is precise and unforgiving. Leverage amplifies belief. Liquidity disguises risk. When money becomes easy, discernment becomes rare. People stop asking what underlies value and start asking how long belief will last. This is not investing. It is timing illusion. The disciplined investor treats leverage like fire, useful in controlled doses, destructive when worshipped. They understand that abundance without restraint invites collapse. That liquidity is not wealth. That confidence must be anchored to something that exists when sentiment fades. Ask yourself this quietly. If belief vanished tomorrow, what would remain? If trust evaporated, what would still produce? If promises were questioned, what would endure? These are not theoretical questions. They are survival questions. The cave at this stage becomes intoxicating because it feels expansive. Money flows. Prices rise. Doubt feels outdated. Those who hesitate appear fearful. And yet, this is precisely when caution matters most. When skepticism is punished socially. When restraint feels like betrayal. John Law's system did not fail because paper money is flawed. It failed because it was pushed beyond the capacity of reality to support it. The same mistake repeats whenever confidence is mistaken for capital. As we approach the final movement of this chapter, hold this image. Notes flooding the streets. Gold retreating into shadows. A city discovering that belief, once stretched too far, snaps. In the next part, we will complete the lesson by grounding money back into structure, by examining how to distinguish liquidity from wealth, faith from value, and how to use abstraction without becoming enslaved by it. When the smoke cleared and the notes lay scattered like autumn leaves, something fundamental had been revealed. Not about money, but about belief. The public did not suddenly become wiser. They became wounded, suspicious, reactive. Where once they trusted too easily, now they trusted nothing. This is the pendulum swing that follows every collapsed illusion. Faith becomes cynicism. Expansion becomes paralysis. And in this confusion, new shadows quietly begin to form. Because disbelief, like belief, can be exploited. After the fall, France retreated into metallic certainty. Gold and silver were hoarded. Commerce slowed. Innovation was distrusted. The lesson learned was not balance, but fear. This is what happens when a society learns the wrong lesson from collapse. It rejects the tool instead of the misuse. The deeper truth sits between extremes. Abstraction is not evil. Symbols are necessary. Money itself is a symbol, a claim, a shared agreement that allows value to move through time and space. Without it, trade stagnates. With it, complexity becomes possible. The danger arises not from abstraction, but from forgetting what it represents. The alchemist failed because he mistook acceleration for creation. Paper allowed wealth to move faster. It did not create wealth. When speed outpaced structure, the system hollowed itself out. The same mistake appears whenever liquidity becomes the goal rather than the byproduct. Whenever financial engineering replaces enterprise, whenever belief substitutes for production, this is the core financial insight of the cave at this stage. Wealth is not money. Wealth is the capacity to produce, to endure, to adapt. Money is merely the language used to measure claims on that capacity. When the language multiplies faster than the underlying reality, meaning dissolves. The disciplined investor learns to read balance sheets the way an engineer reads load-bearing beams, not for decoration, but for stress points. They ask where cash originates, not how impressive growth appears. They distinguish between revenue and profit, between leverage and strength, between scale and resilience. These distinctions are unglamorous. They do not trend. They do not inspire crowds, but they prevent collapse. Consider this principle and let it settle. Liquidity is comfort. Solvency is survival. Liquid assets feel safe because they can be exchanged quickly. But in moments of true stress, liquidity evaporates. Everyone tries to exit at once. Prices gap. Promises break. What remains is not what could be sold yesterday, but what can function tomorrow. Solvency means the ability to meet obligations without needing favorable conditions. It means low dependency on external belief. It means margins of safety built quietly, without applause. This is why the most durable fortunes often look conservative in good times and visionary in bad ones. They are neither. They are simply structured. The alchemist's gold tempts because it offers transformation without labor, expansion without patience, reward without restraint. Every generation rediscovers this temptation in a new form, a new instrument, a new story dressed in contemporary language, and every generation learns, painfully, that belief cannot replace reality forever. The exit from this part of the cave is not rejection, but integration. To use abstraction without worshiping it. To employ leverage without leaning on it. To allow confidence to flow, but never to float free of substance. If you remember nothing else from this chapter, remember this. Whenever wealth seems to appear without friction, without effort, without time, ask where the resistance has gone. Because resistance does not disappear. It relocates. And it returns. Always. With interest. We have watched flowers become fortunes, cloth become status, smoke become guidance, spectacle become governance, and paper pretend to be gold. Each illusion grew more refined. Each required less physical substance and more belief. The cave is evolving. In the next chapter, we will confront its most subtle form yet, when maps replace territory, when numbers replace reality, when models grow so convincing that no one remembers what they were meant to represent. For now, let the alchemist fade into history. His lesson remains. In a quiet study lined with books and instruments, far from crowds and courts, there lived a dangerous idea. It did not arrive with spectacle. It did not promise riches. It presented itself as clarity. The idea was simple, that the world could be represented, reduced, translated into symbols precise enough to replace experience itself, maps to stand in for land, numbers to stand in for reality, models to stand in for judgment. At first, this idea was liberating. Cartographers freed sailors from superstition. Accountants freed merchants from memory. Mathematicians freed engineers from guesswork. Abstraction became a tool, and like all powerful tools, it worked best when held lightly. But over time, something subtle occurred. People stopped using the map to understand the land. They began to trust the map more than the land itself. A famous general once warned that maps lie not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. They omit smells, slopes, mud, weather, fear. They flatten complexity into symbols that feel manageable. Useful, yes, but never whole. And yet, armies marched as if the map were the ground. This is where the cave deepens, because abstraction does not merely simplify reality. It reshapes how we perceive it. Once numbers exist, they begin to demand obedience. Once models are built, they begin to assert authority. And slowly, the representation becomes more trusted than the thing it represents. In finance, this transformation is everywhere. Ratios replace businesses. Charts replace judgment. Correlations replace causation. Risk is reduced to volatility. Value is reduced to metrics. The living enterprise disappears behind a screen of symbols that feel objective, scientific, beyond dispute. This feels like progress. It is also peril, because models are not reality. They are stories told in mathematics. They assume stability where none exists. They extend past data into futures that resemble the past because that is all they know how to do. And when the environment changes, they do not protest. They continue to speak with confidence. This is the most dangerous quality of abstraction. It does not express doubt. A farmer feels the soil. He knows when something is wrong. A model does not feel. It reports. And those who trust it too completely stop feeling as well. They become operators of symbols rather than observers of systems. The map becomes the land. This is how crises are born quietly. Risk models assure safety because historical volatility is low. Valuations appear reasonable because peer comparisons agree. Leverage seems manageable because simulations say so. Everything aligns. Everything confirms. And beneath it all, fragility accumulates unnoticed. Because fragility does not announce itself in spreadsheets. The spiritual law beneath this is subtle, but devastating. Humans crave certainty, and abstraction offers it cheaply. Numbers feel clean. They promise control. They create the illusion that complexity has been conquered. But complexity cannot be conquered. It can only be respected. The disciplined mind learns to use models as lenses, not as eyes, to consult numbers without surrendering judgment, to remember that every ratio hides assumptions, every chart hides context, every projection hides uncertainty. This is not anti-intellect. It is intellectual humility. In financial life, this humility manifests as skepticism toward precision. When forecasts extend too far, when confidence intervals shrink implausibly, when outcomes appear smooth in a world known to be jagged, the map may still be useful, but it must be held at arm's length. Ask yourself this: if the model is wrong, what happens? If the assumptions break, what survives? If reality deviates, is there margin or collapse? These questions are rarely asked in good times, because the map looks convincing, because the symbols align beautifully, because nothing has yet gone wrong. This is exactly when they matter. In the next part, we will examine how symbolic blindness spreads, how institutions begin to protect models rather than truth, and how individuals can reclaim contact with reality without abandoning the tools that abstraction provides. For now, sit with this image: a map spread across a table, lines precise, colors confident, and beyond the window, the land itself shifting quietly, indifferent to representation. As abstraction tightened its grip, a quiet inversion took place. Institutions began to defend the map rather than test it. When discrepancies appeared between numbers and lived reality, the response was rarely curiosity. It was adjustment. Assumptions were refined. Inputs were tweaked. Models were recalibrated until they once again aligned with expectation. The possibility that the map itself was insufficient felt almost offensive. After all, so much authority now depended on it. This is how symbols gain sovereignty. Once decisions are justified through models, responsibility dissolves into process. Outcomes are no longer owned by individuals, but by frameworks. When things go well, success is attributed to intelligence. When they fail, failure is attributed to unforeseeable conditions. The map never admits error. It merely requests more data. This is seductive because data feels neutral. It feels apolitical. It feels clean. But data is not reality. It is a trace left behind by reality, filtered through measurement, framed by intent, and constrained by what was chosen to be observed. What is not measured disappears. In finance, this disappearance is costly. Human behavior, reflexivity, panic, greed, exhaustion, pride. These forces drive markets more reliably than ratios ever could, yet they resist quantification. They refuse to sit quietly in spreadsheets. And so, they are often ignored until they erupt. The map did not warn of the stampede. It never does. This is why crises are always described as surprises, even when their causes were visible in plain sight. Leverage built slowly. Incentives misaligned. Complexity layered upon complexity. All documented, all measurable. And yet, the models smiled. Because the models were not built to ask whether the system could survive stress. They were built to optimize performance under assumed stability. When stability vanished, the map became decoration. The disciplined observer learns to notice when language shifts, when risk is described as manageable rather than limited, when probability replaces contingency, when confidence grows inversely proportional to margin. These are signs that abstraction has outpaced humility, and humility is the only antidote. This does not mean rejecting models. It means regrounding them, walking the land as often as you study the map, speaking to operators rather than analysts, reading footnotes, stress testing assumptions not with equations alone, but with imagination. Ask not only what the numbers say, but what they cannot say. What happens if correlations break? If liquidity dries? If incentives shift? If human behavior turns sharply under pressure? These questions feel unscientific to those intoxicated by precision, but they are deeply practical. The most resilient strategies are rarely the most optimized. They are the most forgiving. They assume error. They build slack. They accept inefficiency as the price of survival. This is uncomfortable in cultures that worship efficiency. But efficiency without resilience is fragility in disguise. The cave at this depth is subtle. It does not blind through spectacle. It blinds through elegance. Through charts so beautiful, they feel truthful. Through equations so refined, they feel inevitable. The danger is not that they are wrong, but that they are incomplete. And completeness, in complex systems, is an illusion. As we move toward the final movement of this chapter, hold on to this principle. Models are tools, not truths. Maps are guides, not ground. When the distinction blurs, risk accumulates invisibly. In the next part, we will complete the turn. We will explore how to reconnect abstraction to reality, how to keep contact with the land while still using the map, and how to invest in systems that remain robust even when representations fail. There is a way back from abstraction, but it does not involve burning the map. It involves remembering why it was drawn. The cartographer does not confuse ink with earth. He knows the lines are conveniences, not commandments. The danger begins when users forget this distinction, when symbols are mistaken for substance, when representation replaces relationship. In finance, this return begins with contact. Contact with businesses rather than tickers, with operations rather than outcomes, with incentives rather than projections. It means asking how value is actually created, not how it is displayed. How decisions are made under stress, not how they appear under stability. The disciplined investor develops a habit of touching reality regularly. They read financial statements not to admire ratios, but to sense strain. They observe management behavior not through speeches, but through capital allocation. They watch how companies behave when conditions tighten, because pressure reveals structure. This is how the map is reattached to the land. You allow numbers to inform you, but not to replace judgment. You use models to frame possibilities, not to declare destiny. You remain suspicious of elegance, When something appears too smooth, too precise, too confident, you ask what has been omitted to achieve that clarity, because clarity always costs something. Often, it costs humility. The most dangerous environment for investors is one in which models have not failed recently. In such periods, confidence accumulates, assumptions harden, margin shrinks, and fragility grows quietly beneath the surface, unmeasured and unmodeled. This is why the wise do not seek to eliminate uncertainty. They seek to be positioned so that uncertainty does not destroy them. They avoid strategies that depend on narrow outcomes. They limit leverage. They diversify across drivers, not labels. They accept lower apparent efficiency in exchange for durability. They understand that the goal is not to be right, but to remain. This posture looks unsophisticated to those who worship abstraction. It looks conservative, cautious, even timid, until the environment changes. Then it looks inevitable. When the map fails, those who never confused it with the land are not surprised. They adjust, they adapt, they survive. Those who believed the representation was reality feel betrayed. They search for errors in calculation rather than errors in assumption. They try to fix the map while the ground shifts beneath them. This is the final lesson of this chapter. Reality does not owe consistency to models. Markets do not reward elegance. They reward resilience. And resilience is built not through precision, but through respect for complexity. As we leave this depth of the cave, you should feel something different now. Less impressed by numbers, more attentive to structure, less tempted by certainty, more comfortable with ambiguity. This is not ignorance. It is maturity. In the next chapter, we will meet someone who turned back toward the cave after seeing the light, who chose exile over applause, who paid dearly for clarity, and whose fate reveals the true cost of seeing clearly in a world built on shadows. For now, let the map rest. Step outside. Feel the ground. When Socrates chose to return to the cave, he did so without illusion. Athens was loud with certainty in those days. The city had defeated enemies, expanded influence, built monuments to its own brilliance. It called itself enlightened, rational, free. And yet, beneath the marble and rhetoric, fear moved quietly. Fear of disorder, fear of doubt, fear of voices that asked the wrong questions. Socrates asked nothing else. He did not lecture. He did not preach. He did not announce truth. He walked among craftsmen, soldiers, politicians, poets, and asked them to explain what they claimed to know. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? And with each answer, he followed gently, patiently, until the certainty unraveled under its own weight. This was unbearable. Because Socrates did not attack beliefs. He exposed their emptiness. He did not accuse. He revealed. And revelation is far more threatening than opposition. A belief under attack can defend itself. A belief revealed as hollow collapses inward. The city tolerated him at first, even admired him. But admiration curdles when it becomes uncomfortable. when young men began to listen, when respected figures found themselves speechless, when authority felt questioned not by force, but by clarity. Socrates had seen beyond the wall, and instead of leaving, instead of building a quiet life elsewhere, he turned back. This is the detail that matters most. He did not seek safety. He sought responsibility. He believed that seeing imposed a duty. That clarity without engagement was cowardice. The cave did not agree. The charges were carefully chosen. Impiety, corrupting the youth, crimes vague enough to conceal the real accusation, making people uncomfortable, undermining certainty, refusing to applaud what everyone else applauded. The trial was theater. The jury did not evaluate arguments. It evaluated threat. Socrates was not dangerous because he was wrong. He was dangerous because he could not be dismissed easily. He did not fit the role of enemy. He spoke calmly. He accepted ignorance. He refused to flatter. He would not play the game. And so, the city chose silence over reflection. When offered exile, Socrates refused, not out of pride, but principle. To flee would be to accept that truth must retreat before noise. That clarity must apologize for existing. He drank the hemlock calmly, surrounded by students who begged him to escape. His final act was not defiance. It was consistency. Now listen carefully, because this is not ancient history. This is a pattern. Every system built on illusion eventually confronts those who see clearly. And when it does, it offers them three choices: conform, leave, or be destroyed. Most conform. Some leave quietly. Very few stay. Those who stay pay a price. In financial life, this price is rarely death. It is isolation, underperformance in the short term, mockery, being called cautious, outdated, out of touch. The labels change, but the mechanism is identical. The crowd does not punish wrongness. It punishes non-participation. The disciplined investor who sees clearly often looks foolish for long stretches. They avoid what everyone praises. They hold what no one discusses. They wait while others celebrate. And this waiting feels like exile. This is the loneliness of clarity. Socrates understood that truth does not grant comfort. It removes it. Once you see how fragile certainty is, you cannot unsee it. You cannot return to applause without hearing its hollowness. You cannot join the chant without noticing its rhythm is borrowed. Most people would rather be wrong together than right alone. This is not a flaw. It is a survival instinct. Tribes protect themselves through cohesion. But markets are not tribes. They are arenas of consequence. And cohesion there often leads to collective error. The spiritual law revealed by Socrates is severe. Seeing carries cost, and the cost is paid in belonging. Those who mistake clarity for arrogance do not understand this. True clarity is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not seek to persuade. It simply refuses to pretend. In investing, this refusal manifests as discipline, as saying no when yes is rewarded, as remaining still when movement is celebrated, as accepting temporary irrelevance in exchange for long-term survival. This posture feels unnatural. Everything in the cave pushes against it. Headlines scream urgency. Peers demand participation. Performance is measured constantly, publicly, relentlessly. To step aside is to invite judgment. Socrates accepted judgment. Most of us do not have to, but we must accept something similar. The discomfort of not being validated. The patience of waiting without confirmation. The humility of knowing that clarity does not guarantee success. It only reduces self-deception. As we pause here, feel the weight of this chapter. The one who turned back was not rewarded. He was not saved by history in his lifetime. He was condemned by the very society that celebrated wisdom. And yet, his influence outlived the city that killed him. This is the paradox. Truth often loses in the short term. It wins in the long arc of time. Markets, like societies, oscillate between these horizons. Those who align with the long arc appear foolish until they appear inevitable. In the next part, we will explore how to endure this loneliness, how to structure life and capital so that exile does not become bitterness, how to remain solvent, calm, and intact while others chase applause. For now, sit by the fire with Socrates. Listen to the quiet. It is not empty. It is full of what remains when illusion falls silent. When the prisoner finally steps outside the cave, there is no triumph. There is pain. The light does not arrive gently. It burns. It overwhelms. The eyes that were trained on shadows struggle to tolerate reality. Shapes feel indistinct. Depth feels confusing. What once seemed obvious now feels uncertain in a deeper way. This is the final cruelty of awakening. It does not replace illusion with comfort. It replaces illusion with responsibility. Outside the cave, there is no audience. No applause greets clarity. No crowd confirms understanding. The world exists whether you agree with it or not. The sun does not adjust itself to your preferences. It does not care whether you are ready. It simply is. This is where most people turn back, not because the cave was better, but because it was familiar. Inside, the rules were known. The shadows behaved predictably. The fire provided constant motion. Outside, things move slowly. Growth is uneven. Cause and effect stretch across years rather than moments. Meaning must be earned through patience rather than borrowed through agreement. To remain outside is an act of endurance. Financially, this endurance looks like long stretches of apparent inactivity, years where nothing dramatic happens, periods where discipline feels indistinguishable from stagnation, where restraint looks like missed opportunity, where silence feels like absence. But silence is where compounding lives. Compounding does not announce itself. It works quietly, beneath perception, indifferent to excitement. It rewards consistency, not brilliance. It favors those who can remain still while time does its work. This is why it feels unnatural. The cave trains us to expect constant feedback. The sun offers none. Outside the cave, value is no longer something you chase. It is something you cultivate. You stop asking what will happen next and start asking what will still matter later. You stop reacting to movement and start observing structure. You stop needing to be right today and focus on remaining solvent tomorrow. This is the final orientation. Ownership replaces participation. Understanding replaces opinion. Patience replaces prediction. You do not escape uncertainty. You learn to live within it without panic. The most profound shift happens quietly. You no longer feel compelled to convince others. You do not need agreement to act. You do not require validation to wait. You accept that most people will remain in the cave, not because they are weak, but because they are human. And you release the urge to rescue them. Clarity does not evangelize. It stabilizes. From this place, wealth becomes a consequence, not a pursuit. It grows as a byproduct of alignment rather than effort. You invest not to prove intelligence, but to preserve agency. You build systems that function without constant supervision. You choose durability over drama, and something unexpected occurs. The noise loses its power. Headlines still arrive. Prices still move. Narratives still rise and fall. But they pass through you rather than pulling you with them. You see them as weather, not destiny. As signals, not commands. The cave remains visible, but it no longer defines you. This is not enlightenment. It is orientation. You know where you stand. You know what you face. You know what you refuse to mistake for truth. And in that knowing, there is a quiet freedom deeper than excitement and more stable than certainty. The fire is behind you now. The wall no longer fills your vision. The sun does not need to be stared at to be trusted. It simply rises, day after day, indifferent and reliable. In the final section, we will not analyze. We will not explain. We will allow these ideas to settle, to repeat, to soften resistance, to move from understanding into habit. The mind learns through repetition, the nervous system through rhythm, the soul through quiet. Now rest. The work of seeing is done. What remains is becoming. Lie still for a moment. There is nothing to solve now. Nothing to decide. Nothing to optimize. The day has released its grip, and the night has no demands. Let your breath slow, not because you force it, but because it no longer needs to hurry. In the dark, the cave softens. You are no longer inside it as a prisoner. You are no longer outside it as a rebel. You are simply aware of it. Awareness without tension. Seeing without judgment. Shadows may still move on the wall of the mind. Thoughts, memories, numbers, images, headlines, voices. Let them pass. They are only echoes. They have no weight here. You are safe in stillness. With each breath, imagine the chains loosening, not snapping, not breaking dramatically, simply loosening, as old habits do when they are no longer fed. The habit of reacting, the habit of comparing, the habit of needing to know right now. You do not need to know right now. Repeat this silently, gently, as if it were already true. I do not need certainty to be calm. I do not need noise to feel alive. I do not need motion to make progress. Let the words drift, not as commands, but as reminders. The mind learns in rhythm. In the cave, urgency ruled. Outside, time stretches. Here, time is generous. It does not rush you. It does not pressure you. It allows things to grow at their own pace. You are allowed to wait. Picture the wall again, but now it is dim. The shadows are faint. You recognize them, but they no longer pull you forward. You know what creates them. You know they are reflections, not sources. This knowing does not excite you. It steadies you. Repeat softly. I see movement without chasing it. I hear noise without obeying it. I notice fear without becoming it. Each repetition sinks deeper, not into thought, but into habit. Your nervous system learns that stillness is safe, that silence is not absence, that boredom is not danger, that waiting is not failure. In this state, value becomes clear. Value is what remains when attention fades. Value is what works without applause. Value is what survives neglect. Let these ideas settle like sediment in calm water. You no longer need to reach for them. They will be there when you wake. Now imagine yourself walking slowly through the cave, not to escape, not to confront, but to observe. You move past old projections, old fears, old excitements. None of them attach. None of them demand. You are not in a hurry. At the far end, there is an opening. Not bright, not blinding. Just enough light to remind you that another orientation exists. You do not step through it tonight. You simply know it is there. Knowing is enough. Repeat, slowly, with the breath. I choose durability over drama. I choose clarity over comfort. I choose patience over prediction. Each choice feels lighter than the last. As the body relaxes, the mind follows. As the mind softens, the deeper layers listen. This is where habits are formed, not through effort, but through repetition in safety. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being taken. Only old illusions are being allowed to rest. If thoughts arise, let them pass like distant footsteps. If images appear, let them blur. You do not need to follow them. You do not need to fix them. You are learning something more powerful than action. You are learning orientation. Orientation remains when sleep comes. Orientation remains when noise returns. Orientation remains when markets move. It remains because it is no longer a thought. It is a posture. Now, allow sleep to arrive naturally, not as an ending, but as integration. The cave will still exist tomorrow. So will the wall. So will the shadows. But you will meet them differently, calmer, slower, unmoved. And in that stillness, quietly, steadily, something real continues to grow. Stay where you are. There is no next step you need to take. No insight you need to grasp. The mind often believes progress requires movement, but tonight, progress comes from remaining. Feel the weight of the body where it rests, the way gravity holds you without effort. You do not have to participate in this holding. You are already supported. Let that idea sink deeper. You do not have to hold everything together. You do not have to watch constantly. You do not have to respond to every signal. The cave taught vigilance. The night teaches trust. Breath moves in. Breath moves out. Nothing else is required. In this slower rhythm, the nervous system begins to understand something it forgot long ago. That safety does not come from control. It comes from orientation, from knowing where you are, even when you do not know what comes next. Repeat quietly, without urgency. I am allowed to not react. I am allowed to not decide. I am allowed to rest inside uncertainty. Notice how the body responds when permission replaces pressure. Muscles soften. The jaw loosens. The space behind the eyes widens. Thought slows not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer needed. Shadows may still appear. Old concerns, numbers, scenarios, conversations replaying themselves. Let them drift across the inner wall without engagement. You are no longer chained to interpretation. They can move. You can remain. This is the difference. The cave loses power when you stop turning toward every flicker, when attention becomes selective, when awareness is steady rather than scattered. Steadiness is wealth at the deepest level, wealth of attention, wealth of time, wealth of inner quiet. These forms of wealth cannot be taken by markets or noise. They cannot be inflated or collapsed. They grow only when protected. Tonight, they are being protected simply by rest. Imagine the fire behind you dimming further. Not extinguished, just less demanding. Its warmth no longer pulls your focus. You feel it without needing to look at it. This is balance. You are not rejecting the world. You are no longer absorbed by it. Repeat softly. I can observe without attachment. I can participate without losing myself. I can own without performing. Each phrase settles deeper than thought, like roots finding soil in the dark. The future does not need to be solved tonight. It will arrive in pieces, as it always does. You will meet it with a steadier posture than before. That is enough. Sleep is not an escape. Sleep is integration. What you have heard does not need to be remembered word for word. It will remain as orientation, as instinct, as a quieter way of seeing. Let the breath slow further. Let the space between thoughts widen. Let the body sink. If the mind reaches for meaning, let it. If it releases meaning, let it. There is nothing to win here, only something to become. In this darkness, the eyes rest. In this stillness, the mind learns. In this quiet, value compounds unseen, just as real wealth does. Now drift, not away, but inward, where the wall no longer matters, where the fire no longer commands, where the sun does not need to be seen to be trusted. Sleep arrives when it is ready, and you do not need to follow it. It will come to you.